Hello everyone, welcome to the Transportation Seminar at Portland State University. My name is Leming Wang. I'm co-hosting the seminar with Professor Chris Monsieur. Today we're very pleased to have Amy Changchien, still learning that pronunciation, apparently, to talk about FTA's impact of public transportation in the United States. Amy is the Director of Planning and Program Development for FTA's Region 10 office in Seattle. With that, I will just give the floor to Amy.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here on a very sunny Friday. It's wonderful early spring, so thank you for the opportunity for me to speak to you about the FTA's impact on public transportation. So just so that I know who is in the room, I'd like to know who are graduating at the end of the spring quarter. And who are in the graduate program here at PSU. Okay. And who in the room has ever heard of the FTA? Okay, well, the professionals aside, the TriMet people aside and all that, so the students in this room, who has heard of the FTA? Okay, so without looking on the screen, can you tell me what FTA stands for? You got it. So, got a prize. I was going to throw it from afar, but I guess I won't do that. So the FTA, so today actually we're here really to talk about the FTA's impact, and so if I would go on and talk a little bit about what you're going to hear today. So we're going to talk a little bit about the FTA, who we are, what we do, and how we do it. And we're going to talk about the impacts of the FTA in terms of public transportation and transit in the different communities. And in the end, we're going to talk a little bit about the career options in public transportation. So how many of you have an emphasis in your study on public transportation or transportation in general? Okay. And how many of you are more like in the urban planning, on the planning realm side of the things? Okay, so just a little bit of everybody. Okay, perfect. So we're going to touch a little bit about everything, from planning to carrying out the projects to really assess the impact of FTA's funding and involvement in public transportation. So who is the FTA? We are the Federal Transit Administration. We are one of the 9 modal administrations under the U.S. Department of Transportation. And now let me first apologize on a lot of acronyms you're going to see. And along the way, I will explain what they are, just because they take up space on the slides. And we all know not to have too many words on slides. So we're one of the 9 modal administrations under U.S. DOT. Other modes would include highways, aviation, maritime, railroad, and other things. So we're a very small agency compared to some of the other federal government agencies under the U.S. Department of Transportation. We are just about 520 staff big, and it's all over across the country, and we're headquartered in Washington, D.C., with 10 different regional offices across the country. So we kind of divide up the different 50 states and the territories across the United States. And as the FTA, we administer approximately $10.9 billion a year in annual budget. And so that's including our own administrative budgets and budgets that the funding that we provide to promote and improve public transportation. So a little bit about the Region 10 office where John and myself are from. We have the 4 states region of Alaska, Idaho, Oregon, and Washington. And in our 4-state region, we have approximately 130 active grant recipients. We call them grantees. And just last year, we awarded approximately 250 different grants, totaling about $710 million. So it's quite a bit of money out of the $10.9 billion budget that we administer. So what do we do? first of all, I think it's important to kind of talk about our mission as the Federal Transit Administration. Our mission really is to improve public transportation for communities in America. And here I have some pictures as to showing you the kind of projects that we get involved in different communities. And starting off right over here, the most recent incident that we cover and we provide funding for is for emergency relief. And Hurricane Sandy, hopefully everybody's heard about the negative impacts and the adverse impact to public transportation on the East Coast. And so this is just a picture of what happened in the New York City subway here, and the kind of funding that it takes for the different transit agencies that sustain specific, extensive amount of damage to come back into service and to provide public transportation to their communities. And over here, let's take a look. So this particular bus, FTA, we're also into wanting to fund something that's environmentally responsible. And that's a particular bus that generates zero emissions. And so the kind of innovative technology and the type of initiatives that we're taking to take care of our environment while providing public transportation, and that pretty much is another mission that we're trying to support. In one of the FTA's funding program, we take care of our veterans. We have a program specifically identified and required by Congress to provide veterans transportation. We wanted to make sure that when the veterans come back from the war, that they are reincorporated into our community. And some of them are injured, some of them needs medical attention, and some people just, some of those veteran population just can't use the traditional types of public transportation to get to places. So we actually have a program in place to try to coordinate better for the mobility options for getting veterans around the communities to get medical attention, to get back on their feet for jobs and other opportunities. We're also in the business of funding capital projects, things like a transit center, things like an intermodal transit facility, things that supports the infrastructure of the public transportation services that's in the different communities. And then down here, we have a picture of a light rail down, I believe, in Houston. And we're also in the business of making sure that we're not just funding buses and rail cars and ferries and other things. We're also taking care of the asset that we fund. So we would fund facilities like a maintenance facility and storage facilities and things like that to protect the federal interest in our assets. And then we're also, again, in the business of not just providing traditional public transportation modes, which is you can, here in the Portland area and also in the Seattle area, we're pretty spoiled with all the availability of public transportation in our communities. We can walk up to the street, go to a bus stop or light rail or streetcar stop, and catch public transportation to get to places in and around town. How convenient. But, for all of us who are healthy, we don't have mobility issues, we can do that. But for people who are in wheelchairs, who cannot really use the traditional types of public transportation, we have other funding programs that support people with special needs, people who are seniors or with disabilities. And so, let me move the mouse here, sorry about that. So this kind of vehicle is basically the kind of dial-a-ride services, it's paratransit we call it, that provides public transportation options to people with special needs. So how does the FTA funding work? Well, we are practically a federal government that we have a set of funding that we administer, but it starts with Congress. So Congress passes the law, and Congress appropriates funds so that it comes down to the federal agency at the FTA level. We have that $10.9 billion that we have to administer. And so with that, with the law, there's, agencies are required to figure out how to implement the law. So we set policies and requirements on how different funding programs work. And we then go through the whole pretty extensive process to then award the grants. Along the way, before we award the grant and after we award the grant, we provide technical assistance. And at the end of the project, and along the way through project delivery, we conduct oversight to make sure that project funds or the program funds are being used to satisfy the intent of Congress and also for the intent of the project that we had so at times scrutinized to get to the bottom of project delivery. So what does the FTA do? So again, we set policies and we develop guidance for our grantees. We administer grants. We provide technical assistance. We do oversight. And very new with this very recent transportation bill that was passed by Congress about a year and a half ago, that's called MAP 21, FTA now has the regulatory authority on safety, regulating safety, and it's new. So I think, before we kind of get into really talking about the impacts of the FTA on public transportation, it's really important for us to kind of keep in mind of how the funding works. So there are two different grant types as far as FTA is concerned. There's the formula grants, there's the discretionary grants. So for formula grants, it's written into law. Congress basically says, well, we have so many different urbanized areas, for example, or across the country. What is the most fair way to figure out, well, which urbanized area, for example, the Seattle urbanized area, the Portland urbanized area, the New York urbanized area, how much does every urbanized area get? How much money do they get in order to support the public transportation needs in their community? So we have this little formula. And so depending on the different funding programs, the formula is determined by different factors. For example, here in the urbanized area, for the urbanized area formula program, it's determined by population density, ridership, how many vehicle revenue miles you have, and the passenger revenue miles that you have. And so agencies are required to report that data on an annual basis into a national transit database, we call it. And so that data gets pooled together, and every year when FTA decides how much money is to go for a certain big city or urbanized area, those are the data that we use to equitably distribute the funding that's available, made available by Congress. But then there's another arm of the funding program, it's the discretionary program. So discretion, if we exercise our discretion, Congress, back in the year-mark days, they exercised their discretion as to determining what projects they want to fund and how much to fund it. And so on the discretionary grant program side of things, we are kind of slowly moving away from the year-marking days of Congress. And now at FTA, our FTA administrator actually is exercising his discretion for figuring out how much to award to different projects and for what projects based on certain different criteria that we set out and to basically make effective use of some of the funding that was given to certain projects that didn't really get used up or that the projects just couldn't get delivered. So we reclaimed some of those monies, and so now the FTA administrator could exercise his discretion to determine how much money everybody gets for the eligible projects that warrants additional funding, in addition to the formula grant funds. So who receives FTA funding? Who do you think? Name a transit agency here. Anyone? Who said that? Hey, only students, please. Anyway, so here locally, you've got TriMet, you've got SMART, you got C-Tran, and all those transit agencies, they all are recipients or the grantees of the FTA funding. So those transit agencies come forward as the direct recipient, and they get applied for the money, and sometimes they have formula funding that's apportioned to them, and that's what they do. And for areas in the non-urbanized area, or we call it the rural areas of the United States, FTA has designated the authority to the State Department of Transportation to administer the funds on FTA's behalf. And so state DOTs, typically here in Oregon, they have a division for rail and public transportation. And so that's the group that administers the funding, and they set up their own project evaluation criteria to determine what transit providers and what communities have eligible projects that really need the funding to be able to, for us to be supporting the public transportation options and choices. Local governments and public agencies. And by that, I mean, it's the local, like City of Portland. They're not exactly a transit agency, but they run streetcar in cooperation with TriMet, of course. But so that would be considered a local government, the city government that has a transportation division. Public agencies, such as planning organizations, metropolitan planning organizations, regional transportation planning organizations, and things like that. Nonprofit transportation providers and Indian tribes. So now, ever since Safety Lou, which is the previous transportation authorization prior to MAP 21, we started FTA, I guess Congress decided that they would like to provide funding to support public transportation on Indian reservation lands. And so now we have a program set aside. It's a fairly small program, but significant, has significant impacts to the native villages in Alaska, to Indian tribes here in the lower 48s and in other things. And so we wanted to make sure that public transportation is also made available and or at least get the Indian tribes start thinking about having a public transportation services to serve most likely and most of the time in the rural communities. And in the past, we've provided funding for university and research centers. And here at PSU, specifically the Oregon Transportation Research and Education Consortium, OTREC, has also received funding directly, well, actually, maybe not directly, but through the Metro, Portland Metro, as getting research funds. And I think probably direct funding as well, I think, in the past. So who else receives FTA funds? Consultants and contractors. So earlier on I mentioned we're only 520 person big as an agency. We have $10.9 billion worth of funding to administer. $10.9 billion, how do you relate to that big number? Here, locally, you have a project going on, Portland-Milwaukee Light Rail project. Total cost for the construction, for completion, is approximately $1.5 billion. So $10.9 billion translates to about 7 of those mega projects. But that's just, those major capital projects. But that's not to say the kind of smaller funding levels that are made available to smaller communities, it would make a very big difference. But going back to who else receives FTA funding, the consultants, contractors. So it's a lot of funding for us to do, to administer, to do all sorts of different functions. For example, oversight. We can't so in our region, we have 16 permanent full-time employees. There are permanent FTA employees. We have contractors and supporting as being part of the extension of the FTA's Region 10 office staff, just because the workload that comes into our office in our 4-state region is just at a very high level that we couldn't possibly have the resource. We don't have the adequate resource to be able to do all the things that we're required to do, from planning to grant making to conducting oversight and providing technical assistance. So we have contractors and consultants, particularly here in the Portland area. We have assigned a contractor, and we call them the project management oversight contractor, to help TriMet along the way to provide technical assistance and oversight function for the FTA to make sure things are being delivered and carried out in accordance with the grant agreement that we had provided funding to TriMet for. So what kind of stuff does FTA fund? Obviously, we fund capital projects. We provide operating assistance dollars for supporting public transportation services in your community. And prior to all those, obviously there's the planning requirements that need to be taking place so that there is public involvement, there's planning and longer range planning for figuring out what projects are critical to support public transportation in your community. So we provide funding for planning as well. And newly, I guess, authorized is the State Safety Oversight Funding, direct funding to the State Department of Transportation, who oversees the passenger rail operations here in the state. So in our 4-state region, we have Oregon and Washington that have passenger rail. So state of Oregon have dedicated staff to provide that kind of oversight function on TriMet's rail operations. What else do we fund? We fund research and demonstration projects. We have an office dedicated, our research and innovation and demonstration office. They are always on the lookout for the cutting edge technology kind of projects that can happen, that can benefit to the transit industry, to the transit operators, to our smaller grantees. And we learn also from our larger transit operators that have a little more stake in taking part in the research and demonstration and can share lessons learned. So we have projects that kind of fund the research and demonstration projects. And I have to mention ITS just because we're in the heart of ITS kind of realm here in Portland State University. You guys have a very strong interest and initiative about the ITS elements related to transportation in general, on highway transportation, and and also there's technology related to public transportation as well. And then earlier on, I showed a photo of the Hurricane Sandy damage to the New York subway. So now, under MAP 21, FTA is also authorized to administer $25 million in emergency preparedness and relief program, which is really nothing compared to the $10.7 billion of damage that the hurricane did to the East Coast transit operators. So with that, take a guess. This is one of the FTA-funded bus. Can anybody tell me what movie it was featured in? Anybody heard of the movie? Well, should I let out the answer? Take a guess. Okay, a hint. The windshield. Try again. All right. Ready for the answer? Have you guys heard of the, Devils? No. It's the movie Napoleon Dynamite. So this is actually one of the real buses that FTA funded. It is located, it's owned, it's a property of the Pocatello Transit in Pocatello, Idaho. And so I just kind of thought that it's kind of fun to tell you not that FTA funds buses to be featured in Hollywood films, but it's just, one of the vehicles, no pun intended, for raising awareness that there's public transportation in Pocatello, Idaho. So now I want to kind of talk a little bit about the different kind of projects that FTA is funded, and I'm going to break them down into different types. So first of all, rail transit. I'm sure everybody in this room is very aware of what is happening. So an example about rail transit, that is. So an example, light rail. This is the Seattle Sound Transit light rail line. This is a New York City subway train that we also fund. This, come on. Anybody? All right, this is the Portland streetcar, if you haven't noticed. Okay, so this is a commuter rail in Dallas, Texas. And, of course, what is this? Yeah, you. All right, excellent. Okay, so these are the, some of those high-profile, big-dollar rail transit projects that are just a handful of examples that FTA provides funding for. There are other transit types. Van pools. You guys, I'm sure, I think TriMet has a van pool program. Small one. This particular one is actually the King counties in Seattle, Washington. They have a pretty sizable van pool program that they also are eligible for receiving funding from the FTA to run. And it is, because it is a mass transportation, it is eligible for FTA funding. Another type is the, right here, not the Ferris wheel, but the ferries. So we also provide funding for the extension of the highway system. We call those the marine highway extension. Those are also a vehicle of mass transportation, Washington State Ferry's boats, one of those in our neck of the woods in Seattle. There are obviously traditional types of buses, and this one is, I don't know if you can really see it, but it is a trolley bus. So it's considered having its own fixed guideway. So those are some of those, more relatable transit types that you know. So how many of you have seen this type of vehicle on the road before? Right here. Do you know what they are? Do you know what they support? What kind of transportation services they provide? It is, okay.
The ones trying to have, they service people who are kind of disabled and have difficulty getting to typical stops?
Yes. Would you like another one?
No.
Okay. All right. So, all right. Okay. So basically, these are more transit types that FTA provides funding for. Is that there is a specific funding program under the FTA for seniors and people with disabilities. So there's a bus, that's basically transporting, and the services for provided to those seniors and people with disabilities are basically coordinated separately from your traditional bus schedule, kind of a regularly scheduled kind of public transportation services. So there is we at FTA, we recognize that not everyone can use the traditional types of public transportation. Not everyone can walk right up to a bus stop or a train platform and get on the bus to get to where they need to be. People need to get to medical appointments. People need to get places to shopping, and they just can't drive, or they just couldn't use the traditional types. We at FTA have a funding program specifically to support that kind of a transportation option. So over here, it's one of our grantees in Idaho in Sun Valley, but just for giggles, I wanted to see if anybody can recognize what those are.
Skis, but not snowboards.
You're right. So they're ski racks that's attached on the outside of a transit vehicle, public transportation vehicle that FTA funded. And in part, that is there because that's what the ridership needs. That's what the communities needs in that area, part of the country. That's what they do to provide public transportation, to provide an option to get people from wherever they are along the route to the Sun Valley Ski Resort to get to do whatever they want, skiing, what have you. And I want to point your attention now to that vehicle at the lower right-hand corner there. That's an example of a bus that FTA funded to run in the national parks to relieve congestion getting in and out of national parks. So in summertime, peak travel season, peak tourist season, good weather, our national parks, I don't know if you guys have ever been to one in those summer days that you just spend a lot of time stuck in the parking lot or trying to get in and out of the parks. So Congress actually provided a funding program under Safety Lou, the previous transportation bill, to provide some funding to provide relief, congestion relief, and different travel options to visit our national parks. So those are some of the other transit types that we have. Now I want to talk a little bit about rural transit. So like I mentioned earlier, we have provided a lot of funding for big, beautiful mega costing rail projects in urbanized areas. But we have a majority of our land is still considered rural. And so FTA and Congress is obviously very much aware of that. So we provide funding. There is a funding program under FTA to support public transportation in the rural area. So the picture right here is actually a real picture in Juneau, Alaska. And as some of you may know, a lot of things get transported into Alaska by barge. And it's no different that there is a transit vehicle being transported, being ordered and delivered on a barge to Alaska. Rural transit. So earlier I mentioned that there's Indian tribes. We, FTA, provide funding for Indian tribes. Well, Indian tribes, for the most part, they reside on rural parts of the country. And a lot of times, it's dirt road, unpaved, and it's rugged terrain, and it's this and that. And so since Safety Lose, so since about 7 years ago, the funding program that we provide, that we administer for the Indian tribes for public transportation, we have been paying for. We have, participated in just getting a van with a higher chassis, or just a van to get the kids to medical appointments, to get seniors places, to really get to the destinations that people need to be, that people may not necessarily have the means for a private vehicle for, or have other ways of travel. So those are some of the rural public transportation projects and assets that we invest in. So we're not just about rail and buses and ferries. We also build facilities. We also participate in the construction of facilities. Bus stops, bus shelters, bike facilities that's related, that's adjacent to a transit project, a transit stop, park and ride lots, transit centers, transfer centers, and less traditionally, we have this big capital project here that was actually funded under a different funding program, but FTA administers the funding and the implementation of the project. Is just a couple, 3 years ago now, we just completed the Southwest Moody Avenue roadway and track realignment and relocation project. And so in order to make better, more effective use and to make sure that there's more efficient operation of the streetcar, and in advance of accommodating to the Portland-Milwaukee Light Rail project, this project came into play. TriMet and City of Portland and different partners submitted a grant proposal to the US DOT, the Department of Transportation, under the Tiger grant funding, and ultimately was awarded the grant to do this roadway and track relocation, and has turned out to be quite successful. Wouldn't you say, Rob?
Yes.
All right, so another type of transit, bus rapid transit, and hopefully everybody in this room is a supporter of transit, and so are these people over here. So they're in Eugene, Oregon. That's the Emerald Express line of the bus rapid transit. They're out on a parade on a nice day, just really showcasing their support for bus rapid transit and public transportation in general. And so that's a parade vehicle right there. I totally recognize that, but that's what it really looks like in real life. So just wanted to make sure we didn't really fund this one here. All right, so bus rapid transit. We also have a project like that in Seattle, and that's our King County Metro's Rapid Ride. And so that's another type of high-capacity transit option that we provide and we support in different communities. So all those pictures, now we're going to talk about words, and really talk about the highlights of what the impacts are with all this funding and our involvement in these investments in your community. Well, we support the infrastructure. We provide funding to help you support the transportation and specifically the public transportation infrastructure in your community. And come with the infrastructure, growth and establishment is development. And so, it's kind of hand-in-hand related. And we're also in one of the impacts of all the investments that the federal government has made is to ensure that there is transit capacity to, accommodate to the demands in the different communities that need public transportation, and that there is actually, hopefully, coverage so that, there's no environmental justice problem, that we're really addressing, not just focusing on getting people places in an affluent community, but also in a lesser low-income and underserved population and community. We're also making an impact on making sure with all the federal funding that there is affordable mobility and accessibility. So those are kind of words that's, sounds like jargons. But mobility, it's something that we make sure that we ensure that people have a way to get places without being in their car Or if they don't have a bicycle, they could also get places using public transportation vehicles. And accessibility. For the population who can't really use the traditional transit, we wanted to make sure that they have mobility options and they are accessible, they're able to access the different transportation options that there are in the different communities. Economic growth and opportunity. I think here in Portland we see a lot of that with all the different rail projects being in place. FTA is also a big partner in a lot of the transit-oriented development and joint development investments in different communities. Environmental stewardship. Well, a lot of times when you're trying to build a project like Portland-Milwaukee Light Rail Project, you're crossing a river, you're crossing streams, you're digging into the roadway, you're, probably paralleling some wetlands along the way, cutting down some trees, and you're going into neighborhoods that has not really seen the kind of high capacity transit that goes into their neighborhood. And that's just one example of a larger project that, where environmental stewardship comes into the light of making sure that we're addressing the impact a construction project would have on the environment. We're addressing the kind of traffic impacts that's going to have on our community who that used to be kind of quiet and quaint, and now they have all this volume of people passing through. Environmental stewardship also means we're also being sensitive to properties and environment that are sensitive to having historic preservation significance and to have Endangered Species Act, that kind of environmental sensitivity. We're taking into account those kind of issues as well. And the next one is the responsive and innovative leadership. Responsive. FTA, we did a survey some years ago to assess really what is the backlog of all the needs for public transportation to be in a good order to provide reliable and safe public transportation. And we have discovered that there was a $70 billion of backlog that people, all across the country, transit agencies are observing. They need dollars to preserve and maintain their vehicles so that they can be out on the street serving the general public, the riding public. Every vehicle, as some of you may own your own car, at a certain point, the useful life of the car is done. It's time to get a new car. Well, same thing with the buses and rail cars and bus facilities and transfer centers and other things, the infrastructure. We are sensitive and responsive, and we continue to be focusing on how do we address the quote-unquote the state of good repair issue of our transit systems across the country. The innovative leadership side of the things, we, like I mentioned earlier, are very interested in the cutting-edge technology. We partner with universities. We partner with the different transportation associations and American Public Transportation Associations, and just to see, what kind of initiatives or technology or research can we do to better enhance the current technologies that we have. And one example of that kind of innovative leadership is FTA supported and awarded a grant to TriMet, and it was basically for, figuring out to do a study about how do you reuse or use the regenerated braking energy from, say, a streetcar or a light rail vehicle, and then to, sort of recycle that energy into, the propulsion system and, driving of the rail vehicles. And so those are, that's just one example of the innovative leadership kind of projects and, the initiatives that we undertake here at FTA. So at the end of the day, with all the different bullets I just kind of went over, we're in the business of connecting people. We're in the business of making sure that there's the mobility choices and options available in the different communities across the country. We're in for the connectivity, connecting people, and we're striving towards a national initiative of, how do we become energy independent and, other kind of innovative initiatives like that. So what does this all mean, and how does that kind of translate into terms that you can kind of relate? Well, in the United States, we observed a growth between 1995 and 2013, we have observed a 37% growth in transit ridership. And that is obviously surpassing the 20% growth in population. So what does that mean? What does that say? Well, I think it says that more public transportation choices are out there, more people are using transit, and despite that the growth in population is not quite catching up, but that's a good sign for the FTA. We like to see that kind of a trend. And there's 23% increase in vehicle miles traveled, so still, transit ridership is still, we're seeing a lot more growth in that regard. And we like that. And we will continue to, provide support and funding and to make sure that it keeps on growing. So I think it's kind of critical to note the fact that, hey, FTA's $10.9 billion annual budget, well, that's basically a majority of that dollar amount is going to grants to support public transportation projects, to support public transportation services in operating assistance, and to support, different emergency relief and, other purposes. But it's really critical to note that really, when you come down to it, come back home, the fare box revenue recovery ratio, which is basically how much is the transit agency collecting from all the tickets that you pay, all the fares that you pay when you get on the bus, a rail, or a streetcar, or a ferry, it's really not covering the full cost of having a system, making all the adequate capital investments, and paying the staff, the fuels, the maintenance, the operating hours, the facilities, the materials. Really, at this rate, 20 to 30% of fare box revenue recovery rate, where do you think the rest of the funding is coming from? Anybody? Well, we can't take credit for the other 70 to 80% because some of that, obviously, is from local dollars, your local taxes and local, other revenues, donations of hours, volunteer hours, and things. But I can tell you, what I can tell you is FTA's funding is critical because we fill that gap so that there can be effective, efficient, safe, reliable public transportation services in your community because of the funding that we provide and because of the investments that we make to support public transportation. Oh, maybe I don't want to go there just quite yet. So any questions so far?
With that 37% increase in transit ridership, do you know what the percentage increase in the transit infrastructure was over that same period?
I don't have that information, but I'd be happy to get back to you. Yeah.
Do you know if the FTA is encouraging transit agencies to up their fare box recovery, or is that not something that is an issue with your agency?
Well, that's a very good question. And it's really a fine balance between how do you provide adequate amount of funding to support public transportation. How do you, if FTA is in the business of requiring transit agencies to raise fares so that their fare box recovery is increasing. Is that affordable public transportation? Is that we're trying to strive for a balance between affordability and coverage and, the level of investments that all the communities are investing in. And so, at the local level, we can't tell the local transit agencies and transit providers what to do. I think it's the fact that we're in a democratic society. People vote on whether or not they want to be taxed. People vote, and the TriMet, for example, does an extensive amount of outreach whenever they're trying to raise fares. And people reflect their opinions on the different issues at different times of, good economic times and bad economic times when you're trying to raise fare, just so that maybe you can just recover just a little more from the fare box revenue. But, at the end of the day, it's all kind of, again, a fine balance between, what are we trying to accomplish here. But FTA is also very mindful of not getting to the locals' decision on how they intend to, increase the fare box recovery.
Amanda Lee is my name. Thank you for your presentation. I'm curious, does the FTA have like you were talking about your contractors, do you have anyone in your agency that is sort of a community gatekeeper that can go into certain communities and try to figure out what that community needs before you provide the funding, or is that part of the grant process?
Well, it's kind of two parts. So I can only kind of speak on the part that FTA provides direct funding to. And so whenever FTA decides to fund a project or award a grant, we have to go through and meet all the different criteria and different requirements as set forth by law. Planning requirement is a big one. You can't start making capital investments using federal dollars without the adequate amount of public outreach and public involvement, and to let people know what kind of projects are you thinking using federal dollars to provide in your community. And so there's that planning aspect of things, and we also planning also thinks about 20 years down the road, what makes sense for this community. And so when we are making the kind of funding decisions and investment decisions, the planning requirement is so critical in the whole process. Whereas, if a grant recipient has satisfied the planning requirement, then we go through the environment and we go through the whole thing. But then the thing is the need piece, the purpose and need. And so TriMet can really speak to the justifying all of their major capital projects on purpose and need. What is the purpose of the project? Why? What's the need there? And so while larger agencies, FTA doesn't really need to invest in a lot of man hours or resources in figuring out why or help them identify. There are communities that are smaller or grantees that are less experienced, or that they just needed some technical assistance. So we do provide technical assistance on that front. And as you may recall earlier in one of my slides, we're in the business also to provide technical assistance and guidance and things like that. Sometimes we don't place a person or a contractor or a staff person onto every single grantee to see about do they need any help. But we always make ourselves available to let them know that they can always come forward and let us know if there's something we can assist of. So does that answer your question a little bit? Okay.
The figure 23% increase in vehicle miles traveled, is that directly at public transportation or is that private?
Private. Yeah, and so just if you're interested, you're trying to figure out where this data came from. It actually came from APTA data. So, all right, any other questions? Yes.
My name's Rebecca.
Hi, Rebecca.
I was wondering, you said that you fund like the ferry in Washington. Are there any in Oregon that you fund?
What in Washington?
The ferries?
Ferries? In Oregon, I don't believe that there is any public ferry providers or operators here in the state of Oregon. They might be private, but the Washington State, so the ferries operator that we provide funding to is actually part of the Washington State Department of Transportation. So it is, basically a public transportation function that we're connecting, different marine highways, and that, it's a larger, more established infrastructure where the formula would really apply. Remember I kind of talked about the bigger, more ridership and things like that. So.
This is a really wonky question, but the Federal Railroad Administration has proposed changes to passenger rail vehicle safety standards to be more in alignment with European standards, which potentially would allow for the purchase of a wider range of equipment so we could use equipment more efficiently or have more purpose-built equipment and for a lower price. Is the FTA doing anything to harmonize rules and regulations like that just for easier procurement and the potential lowering equipment costs?
So that's a very good question. So as you know, earlier on I kind of mentioned our 8 other sister agencies within the umbrella of the United States Department of Transportation. Railroad is one of them, one of our sister agencies. So whenever they're out there making rules that would have an impact on another arm, another mode, we try to coordinate, we try to see what kind of rules that they're proposing to be making, and we obviously on the transit side of the things would also try to make sure that our opinions and comments are solicited funded and are provided. And the opportunity to comment on proposed rulemaking is also extended out to the general public, transit agencies, railroads, the freight railroads, and things like that. So I am pretty certain, and I don't know for sure, but I am pretty certain there's definitely will be, if there isn't already, coordination going on between FTA and FRA. So.
Re-evaluation process implemented, so you can say, okay, that funding is good or bad, or was good or bad, and yeah, you can learn from that process, or is it more fire and forget, except for the small villages or small countries and experienced communities that you give them help, but except from that you can say, okay, this money should be used more in a different way in that process of the funding itself.
Mm-hmm. So that's a very good question. FTA, when we make a grant to support transit projects, we not only do the upfront evaluation of the worthiness and the eligibility of different transit projects, we also do the back-end evaluation and assessment of how well things are going, whether or not a grantee has met all the different requirements and have been in compliance with different requirements. And as far as success, the level of success, we also, if a project is successful, great. We share the success, we share the celebration with our transit agencies. If a project didn't go quite well, we learn from it, we document lessons learned, and we move on. And we keep that in mind the next time a similar project comes on board, into our lab for evaluation and processing before we make a grant. We will make sure that there's adequate amount of oversight and technical assistance provided up front to make sure that the grantees are aware of all the different requirements and the downfalls for some of the lessons that we learned from the past experience. So, all right. So for some of you who are going to be out there looking for jobs, if you're looking for real jobs in the government, there are different levels where there are career options that touches public transportation. There's federal, the state, local, and other. And so there's a lot of acronyms there, and I do apologize, but federal, first and foremost, the FTA, us. At 520 staff level, we also have staff turnover at times. So we're always looking for, recruitment of new blood into the agency. Other U.S. DOT modal agencies, such as Federal Railroad Administration, there's Federal Highway Administration that kind of coordinates. There are positions in different modal agencies, while not directly transit, that they actually touch and correspond and collaborate with FTA. DHHS. Has anybody heard about what DHHS is? You again. Okay. You bet. All right. VA. Come on now. VA. Veterans Affairs. And HUD. Housing and Urban Development. Very good. So what happens is that FTA really, as one of our initiatives for providing and supporting public transportation, is that we coordinate with other federal agencies in the federal government to coordinate better mobility options and coordination of services that serves a specific or different, more of a non-traditional transit ridership, if you will. So Department of Health and Services, again, earlier I talked about this population that have special needs that can't use traditional transit. DHHS, they have services and nonprofit transit providers that they provide transportation options and choices to get people around to get the different services that people need. VA, Veterans Affairs, same thing. For a disabled veteran, we need to get them to the doctor's appointments and things like that. And VA provides that benefit to transport our veterans to different appointments, to jobs, to the doctor's appointment, and other things, and to school or retraining back into the workforce kind of opportunities. And so since FTA also has a grant program that supports the kind of veterans transportation, we coordinate with other federal agencies to accomplish our mission. And the housing and urban development. I mean, we all know transportation and public transportation in that regard, has everything to do with land use, with, long-range planning and different things. And so HUD is right there. We're right there with HUD, and HUD is right there with us. That, they have different positions within their organizations that kind of looks into transportation as an impact. May not necessarily be all very specific public transportation, but transportation in general. So if you're seeking for employment in the federal government, those are just some of the agencies that have positions where you can make an impact in public transportation. State, earlier I mentioned FTA provides funding and delegated the authority for State Department of Transportation to administer certain funding. So DOTs are a good place to be. Resource agencies such as the State Historic Preservation Office, officer, the ecology, different things that may have, elements that they do in some of their positions that deals with transportation projects, public transportation projects, and other things. And at the state level, there's also the state's own health and human services agencies, just to name a few. So at the local level, obviously, there's city, county, and your local transit agencies, and the metropolitan planning organizations and other planning, arms of the government. And the last bullet on this one is other. So they're not exactly government, they're kind of quasi-government. And so it's American Public Transportation Association, it's the Community Transportation Association of America, and it's the state's own transit associations. And so those are opportunities that we know, and employers, potential employers that would have career opportunities for you. But if you're thinking, you don't want to be in the government making a difference on public transportation, there's the private sector or the non-government arm. There's nonprofit transit providers that you can, not to say that you guys came through to graduate programs and get your degrees in urban planning and civil engineering and this and that to be a driver of the paratransit vehicles. But those are, but those agencies need planners and need, experts in the area of coordinating and communicating and working with other transit agencies and different senior centers, for example, different veterans, homes and things like that to provide and support public transportation. Nonprofit transit advocacy groups. There's a lot of nonprofits out there. And again, consultants and contractors. FTA, we do rely on contractors to carry out certain functions as the extension of the FTA's family. So there are a lot of contractors and consulting firms that we use and that they do business with the federal government in the areas of public transportation. Academic research, right here, right now, OTRAC, right? And in the university, at the University of Washington, there's TRAC. There's all these different academic research at different universities and colleges and other things that you can seek to have an employment. Industry research and development. On the cutting edge technology side of things, there's all these different things with vehicle manufacturers, with the railroad, rail car manufacturers, with ITS equipment manufacturers and technology. So there's, different options there. Finally, if you're still staying in school for some time and you're seeking to have internships, student internships, our sister agency at Federal Highway Administration has this program called STIP-DIG for short, but it stands for Summer Transportation Internship for Diverse Groups. Internship program for diverse groups. And usually, typically, it's for undergraduates, and sometimes it's for graduate students. And the application deadline usually runs at the end of the calendar year. So right now, they have already closed the application process, and that they are actually in the process of making offers to different STIP-DIG applicants. We also have the Pathway program that's being administered by the United States Office of Personnel Management, and basically that has kind of like a two-arm, it's a two-arm program. There's a program for highly academic achieving candidates under the Presidential Management Fellow program, and then there's a different, a separate path for the Pathway program, which I'm not exactly the expert on that, so that's why I kind of put it out there. It's OPM. You can go online to their website to find out a little more about the potential and possible available internships opportunities out there. At times, though, however, the last bullet, the different different agencies under the arm of the US DOT would have agency-specific internships that we're looking for. And so for those kind of opportunities, you can just go online to usajobs.gov and to just kind of query for the kind of different career options and opportunities that are out there being posted, and then go through the application process to get to the positions available in the federal government. And if you're kind of interested in about, where we are within the FTA, this is kind of like a general structure of how a regional office is set up within an FTA. And so we always have the management, the regional and deputy regional administrators. We have planning and oversight directors. We have a legal counsel, regional and civil rights officer on staff. But I think for the positions that's most applicable to what you'll be looking for are in some of those different areas. And those are official position titles. They're the community planners. So if you have a special emphasis in your studies for urban planning, for policy, for different kind of that kind of specialized focus, then community planners positions within the FTA may suit what you're looking for. General engineers, we're always delivering capital investment projects. We're always building, supporting the grantees and building this and building that. So how do we know that the grantees, needs technical assistance, and how can we provide that? Well, we have general engineers on staff to provide the kind of oversight, the technical assistance, and just the general support for grantees who are less experienced. And they need some help with, contracting and procurement and other things. We have general engineers on staff. Transportation program specialists, it's kind of vague. And that's where it's a lot of catch-all kind of a position that you could have a finance background. You can have a business administration's background. You can have transportation, civil engineering background. You could be qualified for one of those positions. And since FTA takes the environmental stewardship very seriously, we have environmental protection specialists where they help us in reviewing, making sure grantees projects have adequately addressed all the different possible environmental impacts that's going to be, anticipated as a result of their projects. And then we have support staff, administrative staff and other staff. And we also, because we have contractors in our office as an extension of our staff, we also kind of include interns as part of that support staff. So that's just sort of give you a flavor of, the kind of office where John and I work at an FTA regional office. So any questions? Okay. All right. Thank you. So I'll be happy to talk to you if you have any questions, specific questions.